You're listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast from S&P Global Market Intelligence. In each episode, our experts will provide you with the where, how, and when to make decisions that transform your business.
Home improvement was at an all-time high during the pandemic when many people were forced to live, work, and educate their children under the same roof. What is driving the market now, and where is it heading? I'm Kristen Hallam, content strategist at S&P Global Market Intelligence, and your host for this episode of the Economics and Country Risk podcast. Joining me to discuss the U.S. home improvement market is Scott Hazelton, Director of Consulting at S&P Global Market Intelligence. Scott, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. Great to be back.
It's been about a year since we last spoke about this topic, and I'm eager to hear what's changed, what's new. Let's start by talking about what homeownership looks like in the U.S. today. What do the latest census data tell us about the market?
Thanks. It's a great question, and actually one that's somewhat counterintuitive, perhaps. So, we've had increasing homeownership rates in the country for quite some time. In fact, pre-pandemic, we had a household ownership rate of 63.4% in 2016, rising to 64.6% in 2019. So we gained 120 basis points before the pandemic. In 2022, which is the last data available, that ownership rate was at 65.8%. We gained another 1.2%. So you would not think, all things equal, through the pandemic, we would have had increase in home ownership. We did. And in fact, amongst the youngest demographic of homeowners, those are under 35, from 16 to 19, we gained 220 basis points. During the pandemic to 2022, we gained 250 basis points. They actually accelerated the home ownership trend. 35 to 44s was up about 1.5 pre-pandemic, up 2.1 post-pandemic, and then older households tended to be pretty much stable. But what that means is that on a 6-year basis to now, we've seen a 450 basis point increase in home ownership amongst those under 35 years old. Now, their ownership rate is still low. It's only 39% compared to 75% for those in their 50s. But still, that's a very large increase from 34.5 to 39, with the implications for home improvement spending. That's your youngest demographic, who are typically first-time home buyers, starting families, and therefore looking at a need to improve the home.
So what's driven that change in home ownership, Scott?
Certainly, it is the younger demographic, and those who are 65 and older already are about 39% home ownership, so you can't really gain much there. It has to come from the younger demographic. But I think a couple things have happened. One is rent inflation has been out of this world during the pandemic, and it remains very high even now. It's coming down a bit, but still high by historical standards. It is literally cheaper to own than rent in many markets if you can get together that down payment. And there is some evidence that what's happened is a bit of a wealth transfer from parents to children to get that down payment together to get into that house, which then, of course, they're going to be charged a mortgage from that point forward. But there are, I think, some sort of hand downs to hand up, as it were, for down payments, and then the financial incentives are to own rather than rent, given the monthly cost.
So in the home improvement market, there's a pro segment and there's a DIY segment. I would qualify as maybe barely DIY. Are you a pro or a DIYer, Scott?
Well, I was fortunate that in my high school years, my dad renovated an 1815 farmhouse. So I learned a lot about home improvement over a
Wow.
couple of years. So yeah, I will not touch things that involve code like plumbing and electrical, but other than that, I'll handle it. In fact, my high school years, I was a roofer for a couple summers, so I can even do that, but I will not do plumbing, electrical. Things that can blow up, you don't want to mess with.
Wow. Well, I'll have to invite you to my house sometime. I've got a few projects I could show you. But in this current home improvement market, Scott, would you say it's more geared toward the pros or more tilted towards the DIYers, which is the bigger segment right now?
So in terms of the materials being purchased, it's roughly two-thirds DIY and one-third pro, which you think about this, it's a lot more simple tasks that you can do to replace things around the house than hiring the contractor to add a whole room or something. However, looking at the growth in the coming year, there's reasonable, in fact, this year now and into next year, I think the pro market will grow more slowly. In fact, might even contract a little bit compared to the DIY market, mostly because of interest rates, which are becoming now a factor in terms of how do you finance a home improvement of any size, which is where usually
Mm,
contractors get involved or the pros get involved.
the interest rates show no signs of moving down, that's for sure. So, what kinds of home improvements are people pursuing? What's on their mood boards at the moment?
We have this very interesting, actually, historical problem that the availability of homes to move into is at a record low, all-time low. The supply of inventory on any given monthly rate, new and existing, is lowest it's been in history. So while we have high ownership rates, um, the ability to improve that is getting limited by the number of homes that are available in the market, um, which means that, um, like it or not, you may be stuck in your current home either for lack of availability or lack of affordability, which means that the market has morphed a bit from doing the really home additions or for an office or a bedroom or even a deck during the pandemic to now, what do I have to do to stay in this house for another 5 or 10 years? And so we're seeing less focus on new kitchens and new bathrooms, which are typical of those things you do when you buy a home and renovate, to roofing, siding, windows, the things you have to do, to stay in a home, just as upkeep, that you're going to be there for a while longer. Which again, those tend to be more pro markets. We have the pro market down a little bit. There's a lot of support for that. The very kinds of jobs needing to be done in many cases require a pro.
One thing that we were talking about was the influence of the Inflation Reduction Act on the home improvement market. What has been the impact of the IRA, would you say?
It's very important in certain areas. There's rebates, the Homes Rebate Program, and the High Efficiency Electric Home Rebate Act, which is a long name for, I think it's HERA. And those rebates, which you can get up to $14,000 in rebates for certain activities, it is income tested. So lower income get 14,000. As you move up the income scale, you get progressively less. And of course, there are also tax credits available as well. And you can't mix and match, but you cannot buy something under a rebate and also get a tax credit for it. But if you have a lot of work to do, you could do rebate for one and tax credit for the other. It was nice about the tax credit is that that's been there for a while, but it used to be use it once and you're done. Now you can use it once every year. So that
Oh,
value of that credit has become much higher. Now, what these things are best for is anything involving energy efficiency. So certainly replacing existing windows, heating systems. If you get a 35% energy reduction, you can take those tax credits. But for rebates, you can get a heat pump, which is a misnomer. Heat pumps, of course, can be used for cooling and heating, but up to $8,000 for a heat pump. You can buy one for less than that. So you can really get almost a free heat pump if you're at the right income level. But also, there's other rebates for electric stoves, cooktops, ranges, wiring, insulation, ventilation. So there's quite a number of energy efficiency operations that can be applied for. And those are certainly having an impact on the marketplace. With, if you think about where we look at electricians and plumbers, those fall into these categories. HVAC and heat pumps oftentimes involve a plumber and electrician. Good news there. And in general, we have a slowing market for major appliances. We bought so many during the pandemic that, especially things like freezers, we're pretty well stocked on those for the next decade or so. But these incentives for electric stoves and other cooking devices will certainly shore up that piece of the home appliance market.
interesting. I wonder what ripple effects that might have on the supply chain. Certainly, there were some supply chain impacts from all the demand we saw for the appliances.
Yeah,
Um,
those are improving. In fact, there is certainly disruptions remaining, but lead time for most home improvement products is down substantially. Now, There are certainly problems in certain spots. But if you think about things like the price of home materials, which was once a stumbling block to home improvement, that's now improved quite a bit. Levels are high, but the rate of increase is actually in many cases zero or deflating. Lumber prices actually are down compared to where they were in 2021. The supply chain for building materials is largely unwound itself now. That the problems coming from the affordability side now than as opposed to availability.
So some good news for people looking at home improvement projects, at least on the materials cost and supply chain front, but those high interest rates and generally elevated costs are still with us, it sounds like.
Right. The story a year ago was supply chains and inflation, and I think availability of contractors. That's changed. Certainly, it's still tough to find contractors. The wait times are still appreciable to get somebody on a job. But the problem now is the financing. So if it's a big job, which and you can't get the IRA tax credit, you're looking at 8% mortgage interest rates, probably through most of 2024. You can take out a loan in your home, certainly. The home prices are stabilized in most markets. That's good news. The Your financial transactions have been somewhat muted. The stock market's been down. It's improving once again. The asset picture for households is lower than it was a year ago, but still relatively strong. The problem is affordability if you're trying to finance it. And then your credit card debt is at an all-time high as well. So even for smaller jobs, there's limits of some households as to how much more debt they can take on.
So looking ahead to the next 6 months to a year, what factors would you say are going to be influencing the market? Is it going to be some of these things that we were just talking about, like inflation and supply chain, or will it be labor costs and material costs, or something that we haven't touched on yet? What do you think, Scott?
Well, I mean, inflation in the sense that um, overall inflation, the economy impacts the Federal Reserve and its monetary tightening or not. But materials inflation itself in bill of materials will not be the problem. The bigger problem now is labor cost, which is endemic in the economy, including with contractors. And until the Federal Reserve, eases, we're not going to see that reduction on mortgage rates and therefore improvement um, loans for some time. And realistically, it takes time for that to work its way through the economy. The Fed probably won't act, in our judgment as a company, until sometime 2024, and then has to work its way through the chain of various rates. So looking at next year, the problem being the cost of financing these improvements. And then we also just say that consumer confidence is improving, but still relatively low. If you have a relatively high cost of interest and a historically low degree of confidence, then you don't take out that major loan for the project. So that sort of consumer reluctance combined with the higher rates is going to be, I think, the problem for both DIYs and pros for next few months.
And it's interesting that you mentioned labor costs there too. I'll just flag for our listeners that we're planning an episode on the labor market, so stay tuned for that. Scott, what would you say are the top one or two takeaways from this conversation? We've covered a lot of ground here, but what are the main messages we should leave our listeners with today?
Certainly, if you're a home materials supplier, strongest piece of the market will be the DIY, we think, for the next 12 to 18 months. That the cost of improvements, if it's done through financing, is going to be a hindrance. But if you're involved with electrical equipment, HVAC, those kinds of materials with incentives from the IRA, advertise those because the cost of some of these improvements can be near zero when you get done with the rebates and the tax credits. So if you can't get the interest from the desire to improve one's house just for the sake of living comfort, you can get it from the standpoint of saving energy down the road at very low cost today.
Well, thank you, Scott, so much for coming back to the podcast and sharing your insights with us on home improvement. We'll have to make this an annual tradition, maybe. And thanks to our listeners for joining us. Let us know what topics you want us to cover by interacting with us on the S&P Global Market Intelligence social media handles. And join us next week for a discussion of Russia's economy.
Thank you for listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast. Connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.